Thank you.
First, I want to thank you for having me here. It is a true pleasure to present my work at a conference that takes such an unusual vantage point that compares Northeast Europe with Southeast Europe. We don't get enough of that in social anthropology, I would say. I want to thank Dr. Ieva Puza for this very kind introduction, and also for inviting me to talk about my ethnographic research on favors in former Yugoslav countries. I started doing this research back in 2008 when I started doing my doctoral fieldwork, and I'm really grateful for an opportunity to share with you some of the arguments and conclusions that I've reached while working on this topic in the last 10 years. Today I will discuss, as you can see in the title, some of the words that we use to describe the veering way of getting things done. So informality, clientelism, patronage, favors, and so on. I will also present different bodies of anthropological literature and different theories that are related to these words. I will not offer a new theory. Indeed, I think that there can be no general, unifying, overarching theory of getting things done in a veering way in Eastern Europe or anywhere else. I would say that there are many important differences between Vez and Štela in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Blat in Russia, Znajomošći in Poland, Guangxi in China, and so forth. And the only thing that all of these different veering practices have in common seem to be, can be articulated only as a negation, let's say. So the only thing that all of them share is that they do not follow Weberian logic of rational distribution of resources through a bureaucracy, through an administration. And between them, they are very diverse. So they follow different logics of relating and redistributing sources instead. This means that it is practically impossible to make the same interpretative claim about all informal practices in Eastern Europe or elsewhere. And I would even suggest that it is wrong to try to make the same interpretative claim about all veze in one country, such as Bosnia. So the ways in which my interlocutors used favors to access healthcare and social protection, it was very different from the way in which they used favors to access education or things in an educational sphere or high-level politics, business, access to rare goods, and so on. And I want to suggest that there should be many different theories of why and how people get things done in this veering way through informality in Eastern Europe, and that all these different ways should ideally stem from long-term participant observation. So I do not intend to offer a theory. I will, however, offer something else. I will propose 4 arguments that should guide any research on informality in Eastern Europe, in my view. I articulated these arguments because when studying informality, I found it so difficult and at the same time so important to challenge the hegemonic perspective which frames Europe as that geopolitical and cultural space where there is no informality. So in Europe proper, there is no clientelism, favors, patronage, and so on. In Europe proper, everything is done formally and correctly. So from this hegemonic perspective, there is a neat distinction between rational administration, modernity, functional country, and Europe on the one hand, and the veering way to get things done, tradition, dysfunctional country, and Eastern Europe on the other hand. And it seems as if both Southeast and Northeast Europe fall into this not quite proper Europe category, although in different ways. And the hegemonic assumption is that proper Europeans do not do things in this veering way. So in Europe proper, bureaucracy works. Let me tell you that this is not the case, or at least not as a rule. So let's take a brief tour through some of ethnographic research. Chris Shore suggests that clientelism and patronage have a well-established place in the very heart of Europe, so in the European Commission. During his ethnographic research, there were no clear procedures for getting things done, which would make the European Commission accountable to the elected representatives of national governments. Absence of democratic control created an ambiguous system based on patronage, cronyism, and fraud, which was tolerated because it functioned.
And this is a quote, as you can see. From the point of view of the Brussels elite, so a system based on patronage and clientelism, was the oil that made the machinery of bureaucracy work in practice. Then in Germany, Vita Pico conducted fieldwork in the Max Planck Society, Max Planck Institutes, and found out that some of the most elite parts of the German academia, so European academia, seem to operate following the logic of kingship and dependence on someone's personal will, which is very, very similar to dependencies created through patronage, favors, and clientelism. In northern Italy, Andrea Mühlbach explores welfare programs for the elderly and the unemployed, and she demonstrates how state encouraged volunteers to provide welfare support as personal gifts, which is again very similar to favors, and so on. And all of this indicates that favors and clientelism can thrive even within Europe proper. And this is the first claim that I would like to propose today, so that veering practices can exist in some form within any given social, political, and economic regime. And they seem to thrive whenever there are no clear procedures for getting things done. Because they are so diverse and exist in such different social conditions, we need different interpretations and different explanations to understand social processes which shape them. So instead of a single unifying theory, we need contextually specific conceptualizations of how things how people do things, how people get things done in a varying way in different socio-historical settings. The second argument I would like to propose is that veering practices are compatible with modernity and progress. So they are not compatible with bureaucracy, and they're not compatible with clear procedures for getting things done. But bureaucracy and procedural order, this is not the same thing as modernity or progress. There's a kind of a false equivalence here very often made. So there are many practices and institutions that we usually see as modern and progressive, in which things get done in a varying way. And I already mentioned the European Commission, elite segments of German academia, Italian welfare. So all of these, I would say, are good examples that Western modernity and progress is quite compatible with informal and varying practices, so with favors and clientelism. And following from this, I think that we in Eastern Europe, we need to get rid of a hegemonic assumption that varying practices speak about incomplete modernization or improper implementation of capitalism and democracy. Studying informality in Eastern Europe can illuminate things that are relevant for understanding modernity and progress in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. So studying favors and clientelism can speak about global and shared futures, not just about the flaws of this region, in my view. The third argument I decided to call the global scale. And it would be this: the need to get things done in a varying way can be implicated in global and transnational processes. I think that we as researchers could focus and explore how transnational and global processes affect the need to get things done through informality and favors. This is not always the case, and not all informal practices can be linked with a global scale, but sometimes they can. Sometimes they are linked to these transnational processes, and this happens more often than we expect, I would say. And I will ethnographically illustrate how this link between varying practices and the global scale operates in welfare in Bosnia. And the fourth argument, which you can't see, unfortunately, and I apologize for that, I will read it very loud, is that varying practices are often implicated in reproducing hierarchy, inequality, and power. So we always have to have this in mind and to explore why informality is related and how it can be linked to hierarchy, inequality, and power on the ground. So I will ethnographically also illustrate this fourth argument, how favors reproduced inequality and power in Bosnia, and I will be talking about this towards the very end of the talk. So in order to elaborate these four arguments, I will discuss the three dominant interpretative frameworks on favors and informality. I will call these frameworks culturalist, systemic, and moral framework of interpretation. I will also present some of my ethnographic material, and I will use it to illustrate the third and the fourth argument. So towards the end of the talk, I will bring in a discussion of anthropological discussion of clientelism and explain why analysis of favors in Bosnia must be sensitive to issues of inequality and power. And at the very end of the talk, I will reiterate these four arguments, and this is more or less the planned structure of my talk. But at the very start, let me describe a situation from my fieldwork. This is the background that I will need later on to illustrate the third and the fourth argument. So in 2009 and 2010, I conducted 12 months of fieldwork in a town in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and among other things, I volunteered at an organization for children with developmental disabilities and their parents. I'm calling this organization The Sun. And the parents, who were all mothers, occasionally tried to lobby for their rights. At the time, there was no daycare center where they could leave their children to go to work, for example. And this means that most mothers depended on welfare provisions because they were usually also single parents. However, the basic welfare provision was ridiculously low. So at the time, it was 20 euros, while average salary was almost 20 times as much. So no one in Bosnia could survive just on 20 euros for more than a few days. And without a daycare center, so without an opportunity to work, and without decent welfare support, the parents decided to organize themselves and to fight for better social protection, for higher welfare provisions, among other things. To do so, the parents did not use common activist techniques. So they did not organize public protests, they did not prepare press releases. Instead, they looked for a veza, so a connection to the mayor of the town. In Bosnian language, veza literally means a relation or a connection, while štela literally means a relation or a connection that has to be fixed. So the parents spent a lot of time discussing who they knew, who was a strong person. They needed a person strong enough to arrange the meeting with the mayor, so to get them to the mayor, and possibly to influence the mayor to increase welfare provision and to include the construction of the daycare center in the municipal budget. The parents often loudly criticized people who used veza or štela to obtain things. Despite the criticisms, they did not hesitate to use whatever connections they had at their disposal when they needed them. So how can we understand this? Did the parents look for a veza to the mayor because they got used to favors during their socialist upbringing? Or because Bosnia is a dysfunctional country and favors allowed them to overcome its flaws? Or perhaps the parents did it because it made them feel resourceful and good about themselves. These would be the three answers that are provided by these three interpretive frameworks on favors in Eastern Europe that I will now discuss: cultural, systemic, and moral framework. So the first one is about the notion of mentality, and it is very, I think, well known to all of us who are sitting in this room. So in many everyday and popular accounts, favors are explained by mentality. The notion of mentality refers to a set of psychological and cultural characteristics that are supposedly wired into brains and shared by most members of the same nation or most residents of a certain region. Mentality presents one of the most abused myth elements in journalistic and generally in popular discourse, according to Maria Todorova. And indeed, my interlocutors often mention Bosnian mentality or Balkan mentality to explain why people pursued favors to get things done. Here you can see a screenshot of conversation from an internet forum. One of the forum users discusses why there is so much štela in the international organizations which work in Bosnia, such as UNHCR and UNICEF and so on. And this person writes, "Of course the foreigners use štela. There is so much of it. That is, perhaps there would be no štela if only foreigners worked there in these international organizations. But Bosnian mentality in the form of nepotism has sneaked into all spheres of international organizations. It is startling how friends and family and husbands get pushed into mysterious new work positions. And our people form the majority of staff in all international organizations, so it's all clear." So for this person, the Bosnian mentality is to blame even when the staff of international organizations use štela to get things done. So mentality is sometimes seen as conditioned by nature. At other times, it is seen as an effect of historical legacies. So for instance, foreigners, the staff of these international organizations, sometimes refer to socialist mentality to explain things in Bosnia. They suggest that favors and informality are a result of decades of the socialist rule. Locals, so Bosnians, sometimes refer to the Ottoman or the Balkan mentality or Bosnian mentality, which presumably stem from the Ottoman or Austro-Hungarian rule and so forth. Whatever shape it takes, so in all of its guises, this culturalist explanation contributes to the process of essentializing and othering Bosnians, and generally former Yugoslavs, as somehow non-modern and non-European. So in Southeast Europe, the notion of mentality reproduces a Balkanist discourse through which people, places, and practices appear to be eternally ambiguous and stubbornly non-modern. So not quite traditional, but not quite modern either. Early post-socialist studies criticized these culturalist ideas about favors and informality precisely on these grounds. So they developed a different line of interpretation in response, and I will call this line of interpretation systemic because of its emphasis on Eastern European economic systems. So one of the first attempts to theorize favors in Eastern Europe after the fall of socialism came from the field of political science. The case in point is Elena Ledeneva, who argues that post-socialist Russia developed a whole economy of favors. And this is a well-known argument. This economy of favors revolves around blat, a social-culturally specific practice of the use of personal networks and informal contacts to obtain goods and services in short supply and to find a way around formal procedures. So in Ledeneva's framework, blat seems artistic and artificial to a Western eye because it is profoundly ambiguous and it functions both a gift and a commodity. Ledeneva further argues that blat presents a strategy that Russians use to overcome shortcomings or flaws of socialist economic systems and also post-socialist economic systems, a strategy which challenges the system from within. During the Soviet socialism, blat should be considered as the reverse side of an over-controlling center, a reaction of ordinary people to the structural constraints of the socialist system of distribution, a series of practices which enabled the Soviet system to function, made it tolerable, but also subverted it. Post-socialist economic systems continue to be dysfunctional. Therefore, people still use blat to overcome systemic deficiencies. The result is a fragile balance in which the informal order helps the formal order to function. And this informal order further deepens deficiencies of developing market and democracy in Russia. And so it recreates the need to get things done through favors. It subverts attempts to introduce and apply Western business practices and norms. And this was a quote. Ledeneva further writes that in the same way that the planned economy was not really a planned economy and was actually run with the help of Tolkachi, blat, and other informal arrangements, the market economy today is not really a market economy. And this is due primarily to the key role that unwritten rules still play in the system. The state is partly responsible. An important thing to note here is that systemic perspective follows the modernization theory. If the market economy in Russia today is not really a market economy, this means that there are real market economies, those in the West. Political imagination of this systemic perspective is founded upon the assumption the West provides an ideal model of how society should be organized, of how economy should be organized, while the rest of the world should fashion itself in the image of Western countries. So from the systemic perspective, blat is presented as an anomaly, a locally specific practice which infiltrated this universal process of transforming Russia into a modern democratic capitalist country. Blat subverts attempts to introduce and apply Western businesses, practices, and norms. Systemic perspective was developed in order to criticize essentializing explanations of favors as products of Russian soul or Eastern European culture. However, in focusing on institutions and national economic systems, I think that it fails to question its own underlying imaginary of how society should or could be organized. And the systemic perspective also does not translate too well into ethnographic arguments. Focusing on flaws of economic systems cannot explain how come favors, clientelism, and patronage found their way into the international humanitarian organizations or even the European Commission, such as the UNHCR and so on, which were mentioned in Bosnia. These transnational organizations have good resources and they have good financial support. Yet there is clientelism and so on. So the focus on systematic flaws also does not explain why my interlocutors pursued veze, although the official system seemed to be in order. So parents from the Sun looked for a veze to get to the mayor, although nothing prevented them from using regular formal activist techniques or setting up the meeting with the mayor in a formal way. So how can we think about this? Another answer was offered from this moral perspective. A different line of interpretation of favors was developed in social anthropology, largely in response to this systemic perspective. So for instance, Caroline Humphrey criticizes systemic explanation of favors because of insistence on economic rationality. She suggests that favors in Mongolia and Russia are not just a way to compensate for Soviet shortages or for flaws of post-socialist systems. In her reading, favors persist because they affect people's sense of self and they confer a sense of self-worth. So she writes that favors choose people and make them feel special. Getting things done in a varying way in Russia and Mongolia, which is these are the two field sites from which she draws her ethnographic conclusions. So the favors in Russia and Mongolia confirm personal ingenuity and social standing in the eyes of others. Humphrey also suggests that because of this moral aesthetic, people prefer favors to the formal and the official procedure. So she writes that many people prefer the favor mode. In other words, they will do things this way even if it is perfectly feasible to adopt the official route. performing an action as a favor adds a gratuitous extra to any practical function it might have, and it turns the act into something that is incalculable. So in other words, from this perspective, people willingly choose to get things done through favors, through informality, because this is how they reproduce their sense of self as a moral person. It makes them feel good about themselves as a resourceful and capable social agent. So every time someone pursues a favor, they reproduce themselves as a clever, resourceful person valued in the eyes of others. And in my work, in my own research, as you will see, I take something from both the systemic and moral arguments, and I leave some things aside. So from moral arguments, I take the idea that Vez and Štela reproduce personhood. What gets left aside is the assumption that Bosnians prefer favors because of this, or that they willingly choose the veering way of getting things done. Most of my interlocutors actually complained about the need to access welfare through a veza. For most of them, obtaining a resource through a veza was something to be confessed and justified in a low voice, and not something to boast about as a moral act. What I take from the systemic perspective is its emphasis on a system. I think that we need to keep in mind the systemic structural effects of informality and favors. However, instead of understanding the system in functionalist terms as a more or less discrete and bounded unit with nation-state borders, I think that we could focus on how transnational processes can affect the need to get things done via favors and informality. So I propose that favors can shape and be shaped by global processes. And let me briefly illustrate this with some of my ethnographic material. So the third argument that I want to illustrate now is that veering practices can be implicated in global processes. So the Parents from the Sun, an organization which I briefly described earlier, they recounted to me how a privately owned bus company introduced free rides for children with disability and their parents. This initiative took place through a veza. Namely, one parent from the Sun took this line regularly, twice a week, to get her kid to the Sun and back. And she knew the bus driver personally. The bus driver felt the need to ask the company owner to allow free rides for this woman from her village to the town and back. And the owner of the bus company agreed and introduced free rides for all children with disability and their parents, but only for this one line. So this initiative for the parents presented a small-scale case of corporate social responsibility, although in a specific manner, so by relying on veze. So to repeat my earlier question, how can we understand this? How come a veze was needed to introduce these free bus rides for the vulnerable? How come the parents looked for a veze to get to the mayor to improve welfare? And to state very shortly, my answer is that veze and štela in social protection in Bosnia, where the need for them was caused by global neoliberal tendencies to blur boundaries between the state and society. Let me elaborate. So after the war, after 1995, the Bosnian War, the former Yugoslav medical model of social protection started to be slowly transformed into the so-called social model of social protection. In the 2000s, Bosnia and different towns in Bosnia underwent a welfare reform, which was heavily supervised by different international actors. During this welfare reform, the local community was defined as the key framework for social protection. And this was the event that made veze so indispensable in social protection during my fieldwork, I would argue. So after the reform, it was up to the state to create the social protection laws. So the state was in charge of the legislature, or the state institutions were in charge of the legislature, and everything else, organizing, financing, delivering, was conceived of as the responsibility of a local community. That is, the assumption was that if people who need welfare support manage to convince individuals to volunteer, NGOs to cooperate with the state, private companies to offer social responsibility programs, their needs would be met. So if all elements of this local community give a part of the necessary support, the parents of children with disabilities could get the help that they needed. However, this vision of social protection created legal and procedural uncertainties over who should be responsible for what, on what grounds, and in what way. So it effectively redefined social protection from a civic right that was guaranteed on the basis of a citizenship status to a matter of compassion and luck. In Bosnia, who in this local community was supposed to do what exactly and why, this was left open for negotiation. And because such things, roles and responsibilities and procedures were left open for negotiation, veze and štela had become so important. So pursuing veze allowed people to actively and flexibly negotiate who is responsible for what in their local community, who can provide them with what. And we can trace This idea of a local community as an object of government, which is fostered but not administered by the state, to quote Nicholas Rose. So we can trace this idea in different welfare documents in Bosnia. So for instance, the Sun published a guide for parents based on the relevant legislature. And you can see a table from this guide on the screen. The table compares the former medical model with the current social model of social protection. In the social model, meeting the needs of a child with disability is imagined as a shared responsibility of all these different actors in a local community: parents, social protection agencies, educational, government, and civic actors. In the medical model, on the other hand, the primary responsibility of meeting the needs of the child belongs to the state, and the state is understood as placing parents and children in a passive position. And it was. However, notice that in the very last row, which luckily now you can see, the medical model in the guide includes 3 named specific forms of intervention that are provided by the state: care rendered by other persons, special school, and boarding type institutions. The social model, on the other hand, does not specify any particular intervention. It simply says that the first course of action or possibilities offered by the local community. This is because the interventions provided by the local community depend on the compassion, abilities, and sympathies and interests of the local community in question. This means that the support that is offered in one town is not the same as the support offered in another town. And it also means that as a parent of a child with developmental disabilities, you cannot really know in advance what you can get, what your citizenship entitlements are, because they depend on the local context and goodwill of the people in your local community. And the historically meaningful, logical way to get people in your local community to help you in Bosnia is by using veze. So I think that this table illustrates well that during the welfare reforms in Bosnia, there was no aspiration to create a socially blind welfare system, so a system which will be based on equality of all citizens, and there are different reasons for this. Instead, the new social model of social protection pushed people to be proactive and flexible, so to come up with new ideas about how to improve social protection. One developmental expert pointed out to me that welfare users today have to be managers who create associates and alliances where none had existed before. And the parents from the Sun sometimes did exactly this by pursuing veze and štela. When they got the bus owner to introduce free rides for this one line, they actually managed to create a new alliance, a new collaborator through veze. So veze and štela helped people to do what was expected from them by the developmental reforms: to be flexible managers of relations, to seek new associates, to generate alliances, and to imagine new paths to the improvement of social protection. So shortly, favors were necessary in this particular field, in this particular country, because it was left open who in a local community is responsible for what and in what way. Imagining actors in the local community as ethical and compassionate humans rather than citizens with legally and procedurally defined rights and responsibilities, this idea of a local community made favors such a vital part of welfare in Bosnia. And I need to emphasize here that this idea of a local community is not specific to Bosnia. It echoes problems of ethical citizenship, which Nicholas Rose analyzed in the UK, and Andrea Mühlbach in Italy, and many other people in different places. So throughout the world, neoliberal restructuring introduced personal compassion, gifts, and love into welfare arrangements, and that access to welfare has become ambiguously defined as a right of a citizen and as a personal compassionate gift has happened in many different countries, including in Bosnia. So I hope that the story about the role of veze in social protection in Bosnia and Herzegovina illustrates that favors can be shaped by transnational processes, not just by deficiencies and problems within a particular country, and not just by local and national processes. And I would suggest to all researchers of favors and informality to always pay attention to the transnational scale, to how global processes may shape the need to pursue favors in particular places. I think this is very important, but as I've already mentioned, I do not want to suggest that all veering practices and all instances of informality are caused by global processes. So this is simply not the case. As a research team from Latvia, which is working in Montenegro, a country where I come from, this is led by Klav Sedlanieks, a Latvian anthropologist who is sitting here with us today, as this research team so beautifully shows, in Montenegro, corruption and veering practices can be understood as a response to the seemingly never-ending and very fast-paced changes in how the state is organized. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I do not think that there can be a single general theory, a single general interpretation of favors in Eastern Europe or anywhere else. So instead, I argue that we need context-specific explanations for particular viewing practices in particular fields, in particular countries. So all very, very particular. In addition to this particularity, I argue that researchers should explore whether informality is implicated in global and transnational processes. This is one of the arguments, the third argument. And then the fourth argument that I would like briefly to illustrate now that we are approaching the end of my talk, let's say, or the final part of the talk, is that we always have to have in mind hierarchy, inequality, and power, and how informality may be implicated in reproducing them. So you probably have noticed that up until this point, I discussed theories about favors and about informality, but I did not talk about clientelism and patronage, yet these were also the words in the title. This is because there has not been much exchange between research on clientelism and research on favors and informality, at least not that I know of. So favors in socialist and post-socialist Eastern Europe are presumably reciprocally exchanged between people who have the same economic and social political status, more or less. There are no obvious patrons, because it seems as if everybody is brokering something for someone else, and favors are pursued both within and outside of the state apparatus. So they're crucial for a life in Moscow as much as for a life in a Siberian town or other periphery of a country. And all of this seems to be very different from patronage and clientelism, which presumably in older anthropological Mediterraneanist works is understood as so patronage and clientelism presumably involve personal and dyadic relations between people of unequal status and power, in which favors are exchanged for allegiance and loyalty, and which usually happens in the rural peripheries of the state. And at least these were some of the dominant assumptions of the anthropology, or older anthropology of the Mediterranean. So Mediterranean anthropology often understood patronage and clientelism through its distinction between peasant communities who live in the rural peripheries of a country, on the one hand, and the nation-state, modern nation-state in its apparatus on the other. So it assumed a set of distinctions between the presumably modern, bureaucratic, developed, rational system of the state at the center, and the presumably pre-modern, personalized, developing, social and effective system of the state's periphery. And such ideas about clientelism were criticized from a Marxist perspective. So for instance, Luciano Licauzi suggested that the key to understanding patronage and clientelism in the Mediterranean lies in the social and class differentiations within a peasant community, so not in the distinctions between urban centers and rural peripheries. From a Marxist perspective, a particular moral quality of clientelism presents an ideological mechanism, so a sense of gratefulness, trust, intimacy, or even friendship and kinship between clients and patrons, the sense that they're like a family, actually serves to conceal exploitation, domination of patrons over clients within peasant communities. And I found this very useful, this Marxist segment of the older Mediterraneanist literature on clientelism. And I would say this tension between reciprocity of favors and hierarchy of clientelism was present in my research as well, in Veze and Štela in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in my research, some pursuits of Veze are real examples of reciprocal exchange among people in equal social positions. So for instance, the parents from the son helped one of their own to get one of other parents to get Veza to a medical doctor. And they expected this parent to conduct a similar favor for them in the future, to help them tomorrow to get a Veza to somewhere else. However, at other times, in other instances, Veze were entangled with less egalitarian forms of managing social relations. So their reciprocity was one element within a wider reproduction of power and hierarchy. So some people were much better than others at getting things done through favors. And Ratka was one such person who got things done for her through favors and also for many, many other people. Importantly, she worked as a school teacher, but she was also a member of the municipal parliament, a politician, the director of a religious charity, president of various boards and working groups for welfare, and so on. So Ratka was amazingly skillful in helping people to get things done. And as we saw in the story I mentioned at the very beginning, the parents looked for a Veza to get to the mayor, and Ratka turned out to be this Veza. She helped the mothers from the son to set up a meeting with the mayor. Another time, she gave 100 euros to a mother from the son to send her child's medical test results to Norway for special analysis, not from her personal funds, not from her own salary, but from one of the charitable and state funds that she managed. And I have heard dozens such stories about Ratka helping people to get a job, to pay electricity bills, to meet important people, to obtain documents, and so on. Ratka was a sort of a patron, so she hierarchically positioned herself over other small-scale brokers or other people who mostly reciprocally exchanged favors with one another, and she was able to do things that others could not. Elsewhere, I call her a big woman, and I try to evoke a discussion on big men and how they generate power, because I think this illustrates well her mechanisms of generating power. And I have an illustration here, I hope that it will work, of how Ratka's influence expanded every time she was a veze for someone. So in my view, Ratka generated official political power by doing personal favors for others. So by providing ever more favors to an ever larger number of people, Ratka became politically very influential. So she has become a member of the municipal parliament, a close associate of the mayor, and one of the top members of his right-wing nationalist parties. She was third on the election list for the entities parliament, one of the two administrative entities in Bosnia. And none of this would have been possible if she didn't invest so much effort in providing favors to others. Ratka also worked hard to obtain many different roles in private as well as in public institutions, so from the religious charity to the municipal government. And analyzing her position, I would say that the key to transforming herself from a reciprocal exchanger of favors, let's say, to a hierarchically positioned patron was to hold many different public and private roles, from which she could provide favors to many different people. So Ratka became a patron because she could make things happen for others in all these different fields, in the municipal government, in education, in welfare, in charity, and so on. And I hope this brief discussion illustrates how veze in Bosnia reproduce unequal power relations, not just reciprocal obligations among the equals. So we are approaching now the end of my talk. I won't bother you anymore. I will just briefly go through 3 or 4 arguments again, and I look forward to your questions and the ensuing discussion. So the first argument is that fearing practices can exist in some form within any given social, political, and economic regime, and they seem to thrive whenever there are no clear procedures for getting things done. So neoliberal blurring of boundaries between the state and society provides a very fertile, very good ground for the emergence of favors and clientelism, in my view. Neoliberal tropes such as a local community or public-private partnerships usually leave really unclear who is supposed to do what, in what way, and why, on what grounds. And this lack of clarity over roles, procedures, and responsibilities is why informal practices become so important today in such different places. The second argument is that fearing practices are compatible with modernity and progress. They're not compatible with bureaucracy, and they're not compatible with clear procedures for getting things done. The third argument is that the need to get things done in a varying way can be implicated in global and transnational processes, and I hope that I illustrated this in a case study ethnographically, how internationally supervised welfare reform in Bosnia created the need to get things done through veze. And the fourth argument is that varying practices are often implicated in reproducing hierarchy, inequality, and power. And I will end here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So I think a lot of for thought and for discussion. So let's open the floor to questions and comments and thoughts. Klaus.
I have. Thank you, Carna, for a very interesting, inspiring talk. I was wondering about some elements in your arguments that you illuminated. The first argument, you are saying that I forgot which was it.
Do you want me to put them?
Yeah. Can you put it?
Yeah,
yes.
Gladly. Sorry. Just give me a second.
No, I forgot my question. But anyway, the second question is more about, you're saying it is not compatible with that it is compatible with modernity and progress. And And I'm wondering then, in what kind of modernity, what do you understand by modernity, with which it is compatible in this sense?
Do you want me to maybe just briefly respond to that? And I would say that socialist modernity is a very good example that informality and clientelism can coexist with modernity. I would say that contemporary definitions of the welfare state also suggest that the West and Western type modernity can really well coexist with informality and clientelism. The modern institutions, let's say, or institutions of modernity that insist on very clear bureaucratic administrative procedures, then no. But this is not always the case, and there is no necessary overlap here, I think, between bureaucracy administration and modernity, let's say. And yeah.
Many thanks, Carna, for your solid, great keynote. I have two questions. The first one is that, considering the comparative exercise that we are here to develop between Southeast and Northeast Europe, we have in common the socialist past. And considering also that in your argument you say Stella and Biesa are related, or the outcome of global neoliberal negotiations and this blurring, increasing blurring between the boundaries between the state and society. What is the role of post-socialism as a concept in your research? And the second question is a rather counterintuitive one. While translating your fieldwork into ethnographic arguments, did you have the doubt at some point of letting things be ambiguous, mysterious, and vague as they are while studying informal practices? Because in your book you present them in a rather clear, scientifically reasonable way, so we all can understand these practices that the agents themselves don't understand.
Okay. I will start from the second one, and you'll just have to briefly remind me about the first one. Can I borrow a pen?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've just realized I don't have one here. So the role of post-socialism. That was the first question.
As a concept, as we have in common, and both regions have in common with socialism.
I would say, let me start from the second question. I would say that I really tried to capture ambiguity. So when a given thing, let's say, when it was unclear whether the 100 euros that Radka gave to the parent, she left it profoundly unclear if this was from her personal budget, if this was from her salary, or if this was from a state budget, if this was from a religious charity, and so on. And I tried to explain this ambiguity and to ethnographically describe it, let's say. I do, however, want to offer an interpretive framework, let's say, or an analysis of how and why things happen, which is anthropological, which doesn't necessarily just follow what my interlocutors say, but which adds something to it. And I think that it has something to do with my decision to be, critically oriented in my theoretical work, let's say, to not just, I think it is really important precisely because of this issue of power and hierarchy and inequality. There is a lot of inequality, and the people that I worked with felt sometimes really outraged by the situation that they were in and the position they found themselves in. And they very often tried to, for example, when they went to the meeting with this mayor, they tried to make their case in very clear, very non-ambiguous, like very certain terms. They present their case like, we're citizens, we're mothers, we deserve this because of blah, 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 blah. And they made a very clear case. And the mayor then actually started narratively making their case ambiguous, presenting himself as a big man who is doing a favor, not quite, like and I think this is important. I feel responsible, like to explain who is making things ambiguous and why, and in what way. And
by critically oriented, you mean that you had a normative or programmatic ambition?
I felt I feel that I owe it to the women who lived on 20 euros a month to explain how the mayor made things ambiguous and why I think that was the case. To be perfectly honest, yeah. And the first question, the role of post-socialism.
I mean, does it have any explanatory value for you as you correlate this information?
Yes, absolutely. But the thing is that I really understand. I think that in the so Nancy Fraser, this political philosopher, she uses the term post-socialism to describe events in the US, in Western Europe, let's say. And I think because she is claiming after the end of the Cold War, all the societies are somehow post-socialist. There is welfare state models are retrieving and so on. And I like this globalizing of the term post-socialism from our region to the world. And somehow I think that when I think about post-socialism, I see it as a particular enactment of global process of neoliberalization and move away from the welfare state towards something else. And this is not happening just in Southeastern, Northeastern Europe. It's happening globally, or this has been happening globally. And in that sense, I would say that post-socialism is not just referring to a particular region, but to a certain process of moving away from the model of a welfare state towards something else. And what is something else is actually being experimented at in different places, if that makes sense. So I would say there is a lot of comparative grounds for our workshop tomorrow, and maybe, I don't know, next year the comparison can be even broader. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carna, for this very concise and clear arguments that you kind of lay out also so eloquently and so thought through in your book. So I'm not coming with my typical question, but I'm trying to come from the perspective. I was just teaching key issues in social anthropology, and I was revisiting the gift, or rather the Kula Malinowski, in the reinterpretation of, from the cultural perspective from Karen Sykes, one of your, I think, former colleagues from Manchester. So, and I think how Karen Sykes is shown very nicely, we can follow relationships, in anthropology since 100 years, empirically over time, see how through the exchange of gifts over time, social relations are produced and changed. Now, I suppose you can do that both in settings that are hierarchical, and you can do that in settings that are egalitarian. But I think the whole argument of the Kula is that these social relations themselves produce systems over time that are also shifting and changing, and that can go in different directions. So they can both produce big women, as well as they can produce, they call it, I think, littered woman or something. So now, or littered men and big men. So the question is, in a way, then, how do we connect the apparent, and I think I also believe, increasing inequalities in former socialist countries, so where you did research in Bosnia and Herzegovina, how much can we explain them through making the dichotomy between formal and informal relationships, or how much do we just have to follow the relationships that are producing these inequalities?
That's a very good question, and yeah, I think Annette Weiner was a person who really beautifully described how a focus on gifts and the reciprocity of gifts, if you look at it from a wider perspective, over a long term, and as a system, which I think is really good in a systemic perspective, actually you can see it as a reproduction of the social system. So she has this argument that anthropologists should move away from the studying of reciprocity towards the studying of reproduction. I think that's I generally really like that argument, and I agree. I would say that, I think that the distinction between formality and informality is useful because it helps us to very concisely express things that are very ambiguous and difficult to describe. So in terms of the language, it provides, I think, useful tools when we are describing things to our colleagues and so on. When we were doing research, I personally didn't use it in my own research because I was more like looking at what was happening on the ground and how and why and so on. So following relations, as you've mentioned, rather than looking at what was done formally and what was done informally. Because I think very often the distinction was not so clear. I think that a moment where the distinction was really clear was when people would complain about the things to do, about the need to do things through VESE. So in their imagination, in a normal state, in a good state, things are actually organized in a formal, proper way. And this is, I think, where we can see a very clear distinction. So I'm not sure if I answered your question but
I think it was very nice in a way. It just brings me back to ask. So I was teaching the students that we should always have a kind of a triple vision. We should try to follow what the people say, what the people do, and what the people think. And of course, most complicated is of course what people think, because in a way, but it's somehow different from what they do and what they say. So we have these moments of clarity, which are when people say how it should be. So this is a normative moment.
It is, yes.
But
very often.
us as anthropologists, even if we share, aren't we becoming activist anthropologists if we start to share the normative moment with our?
But I'm not sharing it, to be perfectly honest. I was actually, I think it's what Francisco mentioned. I was actually looking at what people are doing and making my analysis on the basis of that, rather than on what they were saying. I think that I wouldn't say that I was an activist anthropologist, but I do say that I'm a critical anthropologist. Yeah. No, I'm not an activist anthropologist in this particular research. I'm doing activism in my other side researches, let's say. Yeah. No, me neither. I'm just trying to clarify. In this particular case, I wasn't thinking or behaving like an activist, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I'm not sure if I managed to develop a good question. I need to think, but just some comments or some first thoughts. I liked very much the way you presented the research on this informalities, gift giving, and so on, like structural, moral, cultural. But then I was started to think whether it's so easy to put different authors into these categories. Like I also had problems with Humphrey and interpretation of these things. But in general, when reading through literature, I gained such kind of feeling, came to the conclusion that when anthropologists investigate these informal practices, gift-giving or favors or whatever, in the anthropological perspective, and trying to get this emic point of view and so on, they kind of very often present Eastern Europe or Soviet Europe in general, as you said, the homogeneous, but at the same time, it's not only like Humphrey's perspective that favor comes to the people, but they try, like Krisho and others, find what kind of meanings people attach to these practices, which I'm okay with this. At the same time, with the structural perspective, it's not only Ledinova, but also like Francis Pine or Polesa, who write about that. They correspond very well to your first arguments that people need these favors if the state is supposed to provide the medical care, but it cannot due to the lack of resources. Some things must be done, and so people need these things. So I find that they also kind of come from the structural point of view. So it's just to comment that I think that if not to go to these very radical like Humphrey or Ledinova points of view, can unite some arguments from these structural things and
absolutely. I think that
and get the explanation. And just maybe for discussion, when I teach my students anthropology of socialism and post-socialism, at the beginning of each year I say that at the end you will have to tell whether we really need this course. Is the at all, when does it end, what is the region, and we always come to the conclusion that in these writings, which I also like very much, but at the same time, many of them construct us like the others. It's implied in these writings, right, that it's something different in this region or whatever. So my question is, or just for discussion, maybe then we need more studies in Brussels. We as anthropologists should study more, not Vieja, not giving in Lithuania or Latvia, but I don't know what is happening in Brussels, what is happening in normal everyday life in Denmark, Sweden, and so on, because I fully agree with your argument about this, that we should look for more similarities between countries and societies than for as much as for differences, but now very much there are much accent on differences, and maybe something more should be done on similarities.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for that. I think that the first point that you raised about how the difference between the perspectives is very strong. I mean, it is, because when I was reading the literature, I was trying to help myself orient, find an orientation through it, let's say. And one way to do it is to take things that are as far away from one another as possible, and to take them as certain categories. And of course, I mean, I think this helps me to think about anthropological literature on Favours and Informality in a productive way. This is why I've shared this with you. And of course, the distinction is too strong and too stretched and made for rhetorical purposes more than it actually reflects the conditions on the ground, the anthropological literature, let's say. I totally agree. I still think it's useful, and I personally find it useful when I'm reading works on Favours and Informality. This is why I've shared it. And the second issue, yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that the issue that you've raised reflects some specifics of a production of knowledge in anthropology and ethnology in Europe, which is really complicated and not easy to fix due to all sorts of things, sources of funding, different traditions, different epistemological communities. So when we are writing, as anthropologists, when we are writing our things, we are directing our arguments towards a specific community, specific public that we hope will read it. And the arguments and the direction of criticism and the thing that we want to say, it's not the same if you're writing for an English-speaking anthropological audience, or if you're writing for your Bosnian-speaking, let's say, political activist audience. So the arguments that you would make and the claims that you would make and things that you would be interested in are not the same in these cases. I think this is also something to keep in mind. And I've read recently an ethnography of Latvia of Dace Janovska, who was here, and she claims that when people have, like in post-socialism, there has been too little interest in understanding the present society, in the present moment, and how power relations work in post-socialism today. And this is something that I generally agree with, and I think that there is a rising body of knowledge about this now, let's say. So people who are trying to understand ethnographic realities and how power actually works in different post-socialist contexts, which is really important, I would say. So yes, studying Brussels, but yes, also studying Latvia or Bosnia or Montenegro. So in order to understand how things actually work on the ground, without these normative assumptions of how things should work. So yeah, I hope that I answered your question.
Any other questions? I do.
And my second question also.
So not being an anthropologist, bear with me on the theory side, but there are two things that came to my mind when I was listening to your excellent presentation, so thank you very much. One was an article I recently read on EU integration. One of the main arguments was, well, how about looking at the Balkan integration differently? It appears that EU will get Balkanized instead of the other way around. So that probably relates very much to what you described. And if you look at what happens, as in my limited experience, it is true. There's very much informality, albeit very much strict boxes.
I absolutely agree.
So that was my, if you derive a question out of this and wonder how would a Balkanized EU, you've got to be honest. But the other, and also the first thing that came to mind is that there's one word, ecosystem, that dominates everywhere. Ecosystems are driving economies, ecosystems are driving science, ecosystems are driving everything. So this, what you described in your research, to me, looks very much like an ecosystem.
In what sense?
If the ecosystem becomes a norm, then I wonder how...
Can you maybe explain what do you mean by an ecosystem?
Understood from, let's say, an example. You have now financial services. At the center of the services, there are banks, and they are now obliged by law to make lots of information free on their clients' accounts, everything. So there is a whole regulation in this, and what they say, we'll keep the essence, the core systems, but everything that basically is your business now, you make it free. And then there are other people who start using it, and out of that there is this ecosystem of people using it, stay in it is free, and there are other people providing services for them, etc., etc. So that's an ecosystem. Actually, the picture in the very first slide was an ecosystem. So you have the center, and then you have those things, and then they are interlocated. But the ecosystem in business, that's just one example. And governments normally work like this. They don't work like this. And what you describe is an abnormal situation. There's many people arguing that this is to become a normal situation. So how would that go together with the state? How will state look, or how would the state look if it was an ecosystem like you? So I understand it's much more than you're talking about today. Just two ideas that came to my mind.
Thank you for both questions. I think that I'm not able to answer either of them properly.
It's just not.
I will just say that recently I've read Ulf Brumbauer. He's a historian of Southeastern Europe, and he is now developing a research, let's say, or giving a lecture and papers, writing a paper and so on so the notion of Balkanization means fragmentation of a political community, let's say, into an endless number of smaller communities. And he is actually interested in looking into history of federalism in the Balkans. So historical attempts throughout the 19th and 20th century to create political federations. And I think this is a nice, so anti-Balkanism or a-Balkanism, I'm not sure what he calls it now, and at the moment I would have to check. But I think that this switch of a perspective, thinking about European Union from the perspective of Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe or Northeastern Europe can be very productive. It doesn't have to be, but I think it's something that we should feel free to explore and try out in order to see what happens with our writing and argument and so on. And about the second question, I mean, I'm not a designer, so I can't really offer a meaningful response. The only thing that I would say is that a lot of anthropologists are looking at how many of us have these ideas of how things should be organized, and they're very much grounded in a 20th century welfare state organization of things, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the situation on the ground in many fields anymore. In academia, for one, in welfare in Bosnia, and so on. So there's this difference, which different people find different ways to grapple with, and I will leave it at there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have the second question that I forgot was about that you were saying that these veering practices somehow seem to thrive, and there are no clear procedures, which and at the same time, you are kind of critically approaching the idea of developmentalism, but it seems that whenever you say that these practices thrive wherever there is no clear procedures, it seems that you are implying that the clear procedures should be there. And this is kind of deficiency of the clear procedure world. And if there are no clear procedures, no bureaucracy properly in place, then the informality, veering and everything like that thrives. And then I think also that it is interesting to think about this in the context of how we think about these, for instance, bureaucratic structures versus informal practices, and how they. It is implied usually in mostly European, but generally, especially political science writings, that, but in general, that the bureaucracy, the clear procedures should be the one towards which we go. But why? We think that this is a very successful system, but maybe mostly because Europeans came up with it in the time when they were thriving, right? And I'm curious about this already before your presentation, but your presentation again stimulates this question. China is now kind of seems to take over economically the world slowly. And in China, despite all the efforts and influences from West and even Chinese, their own efforts, they still have Guanxi, and perhaps Guanxi is one of their success stories. Just adding to Linda's question, could it be that what is balkanization, but maybe it's a different kind of idea behind this term. What if the informal flourishing is the way forward towards?
Maybe. I don't know, because I think that in my work I do try to be critical. So I try to be critical of inequalities and very concrete suffering that is going on in front of ethnographers' eyes. But at the same time, I really, in my writing, I don't try to suggest how things should be organized. I really don't. I try to take a step back and to think about how, for example, this Ratka became so powerful. So to critically understand the position of a person who managed to manipulate the system, to manage the system to her own advantage in a very clear way. And I try to understand how this happens. But I'm not trying to say how things should be organized, because I don't think that's my responsibility. And I also think it's something that if, let's say, the veering way of getting things done is the way forward, I think that, it's up to the people who constitute a certain political community to discuss and decide. It's not up to me to suggest, let's say. I don't want to. This is not how I see the purpose of my work, let's say. So in that sense, it's not activist in any way. It's trying to understand social processes. It's trying to understand them from a critical perspective. But I don't try to be prescriptive. I don't try to. I don't want to start imagining how things could be organized in Bosnia or elsewhere. So yeah. Does that make sense?
Maybe questions from this now.
Okay, maybe 2 comments. So, part of my time, minute claim. So, part of my time I spend in Croatia. So, and as we know, Croatia is over bureaucratized. So, still, clientelism is very strong there. Okay, maybe you can also say that it was part of the former Yugoslavia. Another thing, I used to work in Kosovo, and I could observe how things are done there in Kosovo. So that also that, and also this clientelism. So, and and also discussed with my Albanian colleagues. So why? And then they explained me that we should go further. So we should look deeper. So that, it's also a society that is still based. It's clan-based society, and so still this tribalism that is still alive. So and that maybe it's not just that there was deficit or glut. This word is Russian word, but we use so in socialism time. So but we look further. So that when was like the elderly, when people would go to the elderly, or what I could see as an advisor to a minister or one of the ministries in Kosovo. So and I could see that also. In order things to be done, in order to get some favor, in order to get some promotion, whatever, people would go, or the person would go to a minister and then ask a favor on have this private discussion. So this clan-based society that we go to the person who is in this hierarchy at the top. So ask him. So and then we know that we do this shortcut. Then we know that a thing will be done.
Mm-hmm. Well, that may be so. I would say, as an ethnographer, my task would be in that situation to try to understand why this happens in this particular way in this particular field, let's say, and to try to think about it. Whether, for example, Kosovo is a really good example, as Bosnia is, of a huge amount of international intervention and humanitarian organizations and also developmental organizations coming in, and I would try to see if and how there is a relationship to this humanitarian government, let's say, still residing in Kosovo. I personally come from Montenegro, which is also a clan-based society, let's say, and the relevance of this and the way in which it is enacted in everyday life, I mean, it's really very specific. So we can't just, I think, assume that it explains everything, because it doesn't. Yeah.
Any questions from this side of the room? Comments or thoughts that come to mind? Maybe you're thinking comparatively. Thank you, and
Thank you.
I think once we finish, before we're being kicked out, so I think you have time to actually approach the speaker, maybe ask some questions or talk to her.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, take photos with her.
Thank you, Eva, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, kind of. I know we're filming.
You like my boss, right? He's lovely, you know. Yeah, whatever. He's a lovely guy, I know.
I look what? Tanned?
Wow.
No, I just look red.
Great.